China-Japan relations or Sino-Japanese relations refer to the international relations between the People's Republic of China and Japan. The countries are geographically separated by the East China Sea. Japan has been strongly influenced by China with its language, architecture, culture, religion, philosophy, and law. When Japan opened trades with European nations in the mid-19th century, Japan moved towards modernization, viewing China as an antiquated civilization, unable to defend itself against Western forces in part due to the First and Second Opium Wars and Anglo-French expeditions from the 1860s to the 1880s. According to Chinese government, the relationship between China and Japan has been strained at times by Japan's refusal to acknowledge its wartime past to the satisfaction of China. However, according to Japanese government, the expansion of People's Liberation Army and its assertive actions have been damaging the bilateral relation. Revisionist comments made by prominent Japanese officials and some Japanese history textbooks regarding the 1937 Nanking Massacre have been of focus, if particular controversy. Sino-Japanese relations warmed considerably after Shinzo Abe became the Prime Minister of Japan in September 2006, and a joint historical study conducted by China and Japan released a report in 2010 which pointed toward a new consensus on the issue of World War II-era atrocities. However, in the early 2010s, relations deteriorated further, with Japan accusing China of withholding its reserves of valuable rare earth elements. The Senkaku Islands dispute also resulted in a number of hostile encounters in the East China Sea, heated rhetoric, and riots in the People's Republic of China. China's and Japan's economies are respectively the world's first and fourth largest economies. In 2008, China-Japan trade grew to $266.4 billion, a rise of 12.5% on 2007, making China and Japan the top two-way trading partners. China was also the biggest destination for Japanese exports in 2009. There has been increasingly large mutual dislike, hatred, and hostility between Japanese and Chinese people in recent years. According to a 2014 BBC World Service poll, 3% of Japanese people viewed China's influence positively, with 73% expressing a negative view, the most negative perception of China in the world, while 5% of Chinese people view Japanese influence positively, with 90% expressing a negative view, the most negative perception of Japan in the world. A 2014 survey conducted by the Pew Research Center showed 85% of Japanese were concerned that territorial disputes between China and neighboring countries could lead to a military conflict. 1950s. After the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, relations with Japan changed from hostility and an absence of contact to cordiality and extremely close cooperation in many fields. Japan was defeated and Japanese military power dismantled, but the PRC continued to view Japan as a potential threat because of the presence of United States forces Japan in the region. One of the recurring PRC's concerns in Sino-Japanese relations has been the potential remilitarization of Japan. On the other hand, some Japanese fear that the economic and military power of the PRC has been increasing. The Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance included the provision that each side would protect the other from an attack by Japan or any state allied with it, and the PRC undoubtedly viewed with alarm Japan's role as the principal U.S. military base during the Korean War. The Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the United States and Japan, signed in 1951, also heightened the discouragement of diplomatic Relations between the two countries. Japan pushed dissension between the two countries even further by concluding a peace treaty with the PRC and establishing diplomatic relations with the Taiwanese authorities. Like most Western nations at the time, Japan had recognized Taipei as the sole legitimate Chinese government. Initially, neither country allowed its political differences to stand in the way of broadening unofficial contacts, and in the mid-1950s they exchanged an increasing number of cultural, labor, and business delegations. Although all these things complicated the relationship between the two countries, Beijing orchestrated relations with Japanese non-governmental organizations through primarily the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs. The CPIFA would receive Japanese politicians from all parties, but the Japanese left-wing parties were more interested in the PRC's initiatives. In 1952, the Chinese Commission for the Promotion of International Trade was able to get a trade agreement signed by the Japanese Diet members. Liao, the deputy director of the State Council's Office of Foreign Affairs, was able to arrange many other agreements, such as the repatriation of Japanese prisoners of war with the Japanese Red Cross, and the fishery agreement with the Japan-China Fishery Association. During this time, the relationship between the two countries were primarily unofficial. The agreements were essential in bringing together a more amalgamated environment. The PRC began a policy of attempting to influence the United States through trade, people's diplomacy, contacts with Japanese opposition political parties, and through applying pressure on Tokyo to sever ties with Taipei. In 1958, however, the PRC suspended its trade with Japan, apparently convinced that trade concessions were ineffective in achieving political goals. Thereafter, in a plan for improving political relations, the PRC requested that the Japanese government not be hostile toward it, not obstruct any effort to restore normal relations between itself and Japan, and not join in any conspiracy to create two Chinas. After the Sino-Soviet break, economic necessity caused the PRC to reconsider and revitalize trade ties with Japan. 1960s. The Soviet Union suddenly withdrew Soviet experts from the PRC in the 1960s, which resulted in an economic dilemma for the PRC. The PRC was left with few options, one of which was to have a more official relationship with Japan. Tatsunosuke Takasaki, member of the Liberal Democratic Party and of the Diet and director of the Economic Planning Agency of the Japanese, went to the PRC in order to sign a memorandum that would further the trade relations between the two countries, better known as the Liao-Takasaki Agreement. Under its terms, Chinese purchases of industrial plants were to be financed partly through medium-term credits from Japan Export-Import Bank. The accord also permitted the PRC to open a trade mission in Tokyo, and in 1963 paved the way for Japanese government approval of the export to mainland China of a synthetic textile manufacturing plant valued at around $20 million, guaranteed by the bank. Subsequent protest from the ROC caused Japan to shelve further deferred payment plant exports. The PRC reacted to this change by downgrading its Japan trade and intensified propaganda attacks against Japan as a running dog of the United States. Sino-Japanese ties declined again during the Cultural Revolution, and the decline was further exacerbated by Japan's growing strength and independence from the United States in the late 1960s. The PRC was especially concerned that Japan might remilitarize to compensate for the reduced U.S. military presence in Asia brought about under President Richard Nixon. As the turmoil subsided, however, the Japanese government, already under pressure both from the pro-Beijing factions in the LDP and from opposition elements, sought to adopt a more forward posture. 1970s. In December 1971, the Chinese and Japanese trade liaison offices began to discuss the possibility of restoring diplomatic trade relations, and in July 1972, Kakuei Tanaka succeeded Eisaku Sato as the new Japanese Prime Minister. Tanaka assumed a normalization of the Sino-Japanese relations. Furthermore, the 1972 Nixon visit to China encouraged the normalization process. His visit to Beijing culminated in the signing a joint statement on September 29, 1972. It established diplomatic relations between Japan and the PRC. From the Chinese point of view, an impressive compromise was attained. The Japanese agreed to most of the PRC's demands, including the political status of Taiwan. Subsequently, the bilateral economic relationships grew rapidly. 28 Japanese and 30 Chinese economic and trade missions visited the partner country. The joint communiqué says, "The abnormal state of affairs that has hitherto existed between Japan and the People's Republic of China is terminated on the date on which this joint communiqué is issued. The government of Japan recognizes that government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. The government of the People's Republic of China reiterates that Taiwan is an inalienable part of the territory of the People's Republic of China. The government of Japan fully understands and respects the stand of the government of the People's Republic of China, and it firmly maintains its stand under Article 8 of the Potsdam Proclamation. The government of Japan and the government of People's Republic of China have decided to establish diplomatic relations as from September 29, 1972. The two governments have decided to take all necessary measures for the establishment and the performance of the functions of each other's embassy in the respective capitals in accordance with international law and practice, and to exchange ambassadors as speedily as possible. The government of the People's Republic of China declares that in the interest of the friendship between the Chinese and the Japanese peoples, it renounces its demand for war reparation from Japan. The government of Japan and the government of the People's Republic of China agree to establish relations of perpetual peace and friendship between the two countries on the basis of the principles of mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. The two governments confirm that, in conformity with the foregoing principles and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, Japan and China shall in the mutual relations settle all disputes by peaceful means and shall refrain from the use of threat of force. The normalization of relations between Japan and China is not directed against any third country. Neither of the two countries should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish such hegemony. The government of Japan and the government of the People's Republic of China have agreed that, with a view to solidifying and developing the relations of peace and friendship between the two countries, the two governments will enter into negotiations for the purpose of concluding a treaty of peace and friendship. The government of Japan and the government of the People's Republic of China have agreed that, with a view to further promoting relations between the two countries and to expanding interchanges of people, the two governments will, is necessarily in taking account of the existing non-governmental arrangements, enter into negotiations for the purpose of concluding agreements concerning such matters as trade, shipping, aviation, and fisheries. On 5 February 1973, the PRC and Japan agreed to re-establish diplomatic relations. Negotiations for a Sino-Japanese peace and friendship treaty began in 1974, but soon broken off in September 1975. The PRC insisted the anti-hegemony clause, which was directed at the Soviet Union, be included in the treaty. Japan objected the clause and did not wish to get involved in the Sino-Soviet split. However, the death of Mao Zedong in 1976 brought economic reform to the PRC, which led to the expected Japanese investment in the Chinese economy. In February 1978, a long-term private trade agreement led to an arrangement by which trade between Japan and the PRC would increase to a level of $20 billion by 1985, through exports from Japan of plants and equipment, technology, construction materials, and machine parts in return for coal and crude oil. This long-term plan, which gave rise to inflated expectations, proved overambitious and was drastically cut back the following year as the PRC was forced to reorder its development priorities and scale down its commitments. However, the signing of the agreement reflected the wish on both sides to improve relations. In April 1978, a dispute over the territoriality of the Senkaku Islands, a cluster of barren islets north of Taiwan and south of the Ryukyu Islands, flared up and threatened to disrupt the developing momentum toward resuming peace treaty talks. Restraint on both sides led to a resolution. At the end of 1978, the then Prime Minister Ohira said the government of Japan would offer ODA to China. Official development assistance from Japan to China began in 1979 and from that time to the present, approximately 3.1331 trillion yen in loan aid, 145.7 billion yen in grant aid, and 144.6 billion yen in technical cooperation have been implemented up to June 2005 and has not ended. Talks on the peace treaty were resumed in July, and the agreement was reached in August on a compromised version of the anti-hegemony clause. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Japan and the People's Republic of China was signed on August 12 and came into effect October 23, 1978, under the two leaders of Deng Xiaoping and Fukuda Takeo. 1980s. A golden age marked by the development of complementary interests flourished from the 1980s to the mid-1990s. Sino-Japanese relations made considerable progress in the 1980s. The General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, Hu Yaobang, visited Japan in November 1983, and Prime Minister Nakasan reciprocated by visiting the PRC in March 1984. While Japanese enthusiasm for the Chinese market reached highs and lows, broad strategic considerations in the 1980s steadied Tokyo's policy toward Beijing. In fact, Japan's heavy involvement in the PRC's economic modernization reflected in part a determination to encourage peaceful domestic development in the PRC, to draw the PRC into gradually expanding links with Japan and the West, and to reduce the PRC's interest in returning to its more provocative foreign policies of the past. Many of Japan's concerns about the Soviet Union duplicated PRC's worries. They included the increased deployment in East Asia of Soviet armaments, the growth of the Soviet Pacific Fleet, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the potential threat it posed to Persian Gulf oil supply routes, and an increased Soviet military presence in Vietnam. In response, Japan and the PRC adopted notable complementary foreign policies, designed to isolate the Soviet Soviet Union and its allies politically and to promote regional stability. In Southeast Asia, both countries provided strong diplomatic backing for the efforts of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to bring about a Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia. Japan provided substantial economic assistance to Thailand to help with resettling Indo-Chinese refugees. The PRC was a key supporter of Thailand and of the Cambodian resistance groups. In Southwest Asia, both nations backed the condemnation of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. They refused to recognize the Soviet-backed Kabul regime, and sought through diplomatic and economic means to bolster Pakistan. In Northeast Asia, Japan and the PRC sought to moderate the behavior of the Korean partners, South Korea and North Korea, to reduce tensions. In 1983, both the PRC and Japan strongly criticized the Soviet proposal to redeploy some of their armaments to Asia. Japan encountered a number of episodes of friction with the PRC during the rest of the 1980s. In 1982, a serious political controversy was aroused over a revision of Japanese history textbooks dealing with the war between China and Japan during 1931–45. In late 1985, Chinese officials complained harshly about Prime Minister Nakasone's visit to the Yasukuni Shrine, which commemorates Japanese soldiers who had died in service of the emperor, some of whom are war criminals. See also China Internet Information Center, the issue of Guanghua Liao. Under Prime Minister Nakasone Yasuhiro, the Japanese government re-emphasized the relationship to the United States. The U.S. strategic emphasis upon East Asia allegedly shifted the PRC to Japan in 1983. Beijing felt isolation and concerning anew about possible revival of Japanese militarism. By the mid-1983, Beijing had decided, coincidentally with its decision to improve relations with the Reagan administration of the United States, to solidify ties with Japan. Economic issues centered on Chinese complaints that the influx of Japanese products into the PRC had produced a serious trade deficit for the PRC. Nakasone and other Japanese leaders tried to relieve above concerns during visits to Beijing and in other talks with Chinese officials. They assured the Chinese of Japan's continued large-scale development and commercial assistance, and to obstruct any Sino-Soviet realignment against Japan. The two countries also concluded a bilateral investment treaty in 1988 after 7 years of tough negotiation, where China finally agreed to grant Japanese investments with national treatment. At the popular level in the PRC, it was not easy to allay concerns. Student-led demonstrations against Japan, on the one hand, helped reinforce Chinese officials' warnings to their Japanese counterparts. On the other hand, it was more difficult to change popular opinion in the PRC than it was to change the opinions of the Chinese officials. Meanwhile, the removal of the General Secretary of the CPC, Hu Yaobang, in 1987 was detrimental to smooth Sino-Japanese relations because Hu had built personal relationships with Nakasone and other Japanese leaders. The PRC government's harsh crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrations in the spring of 1989 caused Japanese policymakers to realize that the new situation in the PRC was extremely delicate and required careful handling to avoid Japanese actions that would push the PRC further away from reforms. Beijing leaders reportedly judged at first that the industrialized countries would relatively quickly resume normal business with the PRC after a brief period of complaint over the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. When that did not happen, the PRC officials made strong suggestions to Japanese officials that they break from most industrialized nations by pursuing normal economic intercourse with the PRC, consistent with Tokyo's long-term interests in mainland China. Japanese leaders like West European and U.S. leaders were careful not to isolate the PRC and continued trade and other relations generally consistent with the policies of other industrialized democracies. But they also followed the United States' lead in limiting economic relations to the PRC. 1990s. Bilateral structural change developed during the late 1990s to 2004. Japan had been investing in the PRC during the early 1990s, and trade decreased during the late 1990s but resurged at the millennium. The resurgence might have been because of the prospect of the PRC becoming a part of the World Trade Organization. 2000s. By 2001, China's international trade was the sixth largest in the world, and over the next several years it was expected to be just under Japan, the fourth largest. Today, Japan is beginning to invest in the PRC. A growing movement to cease official development assistance support is beginning to flourish within the Japanese public. Many argue that Japan should cease aid to the PRC for two major reasons. It effectively subsidizes the PRC's military build-up to give economic assistance to the PRC, which increasingly threatens Japan's security. It helps the PRC to give assistance to many other developing countries, particularly in Africa, and there is no need to assist any country that can afford to assist others. Those who argue against cutting developmental support to the PRC note that by aiding the PRC, the Chinese government is more likely to play by the rules of the international system, and that aid is an atonement for Japan's pre-war and World War II damage. Tension erupted periodically over trade and technology issues. The PRC concern over potential Japanese military resurgence and controversy regarding Japan's relations with Taiwan. In early 2005, Japan and the United States had issued a joint statement which encourages the peaceful resolution of issues concerning the Taiwan Strait through dialogue. The PRC was angered by the statement and protested the interference in its internal affairs. The anti-secession law was passed by the Third Conference of the 10th National People's Congress of the PRC and was ratified in March 2005, and then the law went into effect immediately. Subsequently, anti-Japanese demonstrations took place simultaneously in the PRC in other Asian countries. However, the warm relationship between the PRC and Japan had been revived by two Japanese prime ministers, Shinzo Abe and particularly Yasuo Fukuda, whose father achieved to conclude the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Japan and the People's Republic of China. In May 2008, Hu Jintao was the first Chinese president in over a decade to be invited to Japan on an official visit, and called for increased cooperation between the two countries. A fourth joint statement by President Hu and Japanese Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda read, "The two sides resolved to face history squarely, advance toward the future, and endeavor with persistence to create a new era of a mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests between Japan and China." They announced that they would align Japan-China relations with the trends of international community and together forge a bright future for the Asia-Pacific region and the world while deepening mutual understanding, building mutual trust, and expanding mutually beneficial cooperation between the nations in an ongoing fashion into the future. In October 2008, Japanese Prime Minister Aso Taro visited Beijing to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the conclusion of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Japan and the People's Republic of China. At the reception, he remarked on his personal conviction regarding Japan-China relations. "We should not constrain ourselves in the name of friendship between Japan and China. Rather, sound competition and active cooperation will constitute a true, mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests." Confucius said, "At 30, I stood firm." Quote, "In the same way, Japan and China must now stand atop the international stage and work to spread to the rest of the world this spirit of benefiting together." Although Japanese and Chinese policymakers claimed that ice-breaking and ice-melting occurred in the bilateral relationship between 2006 and 2010. However, none of the fundamental problems related to history and disputed territory had been resolved, and so there was a virtual iceberg under the surface.